So, do you see comics, art, and censorship in the Middle East, an introduction with a picture of a little boy?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So, I'm obligated to start this presentation with a trigger warning. Because of the subject material, there are going to be a lot of violent and disturbing images and stories about a lot of bad things happening to artists. So if somebody is uncomfortable, they might want to turn away. Uh, I thought I should start there. Okay. So this is a drawing by Sue Szymanski-Beatala, who is a Jewish American feminist cartoonist. Um, it's a drawing she did in the 1970s, and it's a drawing of a demonstration by students who were protesting against the Shah of Iran. And as you can see, this protest takes place in Washington, D.C. And as you can perhaps also see, everyone is masked. So why were all these students masked? These students were masked because they were protesting against the Shah of Iran, who was the monarch of Iran, and the Iranian secret police, called the Savak, were active in the United States, so that the Savak would report on the activity of Iranian students in the United States. And if you were opposing the Shah, maybe something would happen to you, or even more likely, something would happen to members of your family back in Iran. Therefore, everybody was masked. Um, and as some of you will know, um, the Shah of Iran was, the monarch of Iran was put into place when the United States overthrew the democratically elected president of Iran and put the monarchy into power. So Iranian students knew that the United States supported their monarch, the United States supported the Savak, and that the Savak could do what they wanted to them. And this was the situation of Iranian students in the United States in the 1970s. And that's why they're having a demonstration with masks on. Um, now, in 1979, the Shah of Iran was overthrown, and students in Iran took over the American embassy and held the embassy staff hostage. Um, and if you understand Iranian history, they had a very good reason to do that, which is that they were worried that the United States would overthrow the new government as they'd overthrown previous governments, and a way to prevent that was to hold the embassy staff hostage. However, the response of Americans to the Iran hostage crisis, as it was called, you can see what their response was. On the left here are these buttons that say things like nuke Iran, fuck Iran, um, Iran sucks. And of course, when the people put that on, they didn't say Iran, they said fuck Iran, nuke Iran, fuck Iran. Um, so that's what people were wearing in the United States. So this is something that happens in the United States. Okay. This is the first time I have experienced it, but then years after that, I sort of experienced this on a regular basis, that the United States has enormous influence over the situation of countries in the Middle East. And most Americans are completely oblivious to this. And then somebody does something like seizing an embassy or blowing up a building, um, or killing somebody, and Americans go running around yelling, "Why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? This is awful. Um, why do they hate us?" Um, so those of us in the wonderful world of comics had our own special "Why do they hate us" moment when the artists at the French magazine Charlie Hebdo were murdered um, by armed Muslim extremists um, for doing cartoons that they felt were disrespectful of the Muslim religion. Um, and of course, that's a really terrible thing. Nobody should be physically punished for doing a piece of artwork that somebody else doesn't like. That's a terrible thing to happen. Um, but of course, all of us in the world of comics had our big "why do they hate us" moment and say, how can they possibly do such a thing? And um, when this happened, um, I felt, and my friend Ethan also felt, that there was something missing in this conversation. There was some type of context that was missing in this conversation. Um, that in the same sense that Americans didn't understand the history of Iran, um, people in comics didn't understand um, issues of art and censorship and repression in the Middle East. Um, and so had a kind of two-dimensional reaction to that. And so that's why I've put together this presentation. So to start with, there's this phrase, the Middle East. Um, it's an interesting phrase. What are these countries halfway to the east of? Does anyone I'm talking to know the origin of the phrase Middle East?
Isn't it supposed to be Asia? Why? I don't know. I never understood that. I thought it was political where you wanted to make it sound more like Europe. So then they started saying Middle East, but I don't know.
Okay. Um, the origin of the term Middle East was that the British, the office of the British Empire in India in the 1850s was called the Middle East Office. In other words, it's halfway to China from England. Halfway east of England was India. Okay. Now, India became independent. The British had to move their offices. They moved the Middle East office to Cairo. And after that, ever since, Egypt, Palestine, Israel, what have you, have been called the Middle East.
Can I
This,
interject?
okay.
Because originally, when the Middle East was in India, Egypt and Palestine were the Near East. So, because they were closest to Europe. And what's weird now is today, if you're talking about contemporary Palestine and Syria, you call it the Middle East. But if you're talking about ancient, it is the ancient Near East. And it's the same area.
And all of these terms, including the ancient Near East, were come up by Europeans.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
that was a
was
term of European archaeology. So, okay, this phrase, the Middle East, is has nothing to do with people who live there. So, what do we call this? Well, we could call it the Middle East, but not,
that's
that's
Eurocentric.
Eurocentric. We could call it the Arab world, but everyone there isn't an Arab. We could call it the Muslim world, but there are Christians, there are Druze, there are all kinds of people there. So none of these phrases are accurate. Okay? So I think to start with, the fact that we don't have a accurate word for this, but we all know what we're talking about, speaks to the fact that people in this region do not have a lot of agency. They do not have a lot of control over how they are positioned in the world. So we don't have a word that they came up with that we all use for them. And that speaks to the lack not only of democracy, but even of sovereignty. That not only are most of the states there not democratic, they're also not even run by their own dictators. They're run by people in other countries. Okay. But in spite of that, there's a very active political discussion in that part of the world. There's a very active newspaper culture, and there is a lot of interesting political cartooning and political art. And that's what we're going to be looking at here.
You know, it would be interesting. I should ask, like people that live there, like people in Syria and Palestine and Egypt. What do they say? Do they use our term Middle East? What do they say in their own languages today? I wonder.
Okay, we'll check that out.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to start with obviously Naji al-Ali is about the most well-known Palestinian cartoonist. He's one of the most well-known cartoonists in the Arab world. Um, he had a relatively short life. Um, he died in the 1980s, and a lot of his art is about the displacement of Palestinians from Israel. Um, but that's not the exclusive subject material. Um, Najee's signature is this little boy who seems to be watching whatever is going on. Usually there's some scene of violence or brutality, and there's a child looking on. Um, and in fact, children play a big role in Najee's imagery. Um, And there's a kind of odd combination of things that seem delicate and fragile and things that are brutal in Najee's work. And Najee did not just do art critical of Israel, he did art critical of all the regimes um, of the Arab countries. And he also did artwork that was critical of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And because of that, when Naji Ali was assassinated in 1989, um, nobody was sure who was behind the assassination. It could have been the Mossad, it could have been the PLO, it could have been any number of regimes in the Middle East. Um, and the people who did the killing were not apprehended. So we really don't know who killed Naji al-Ali, um, who was assassinated in London in 1989. Um, Suleiman Mansour is a Palestinian painter who has lived most of his life in East Jerusalem. And Suleiman um, devoted a lot of his life to trying to build an artistic community in the occupied territories in the West Bank and organized a number of art shows, has tried to set up an art school. Um, and one of the problems they faced in the 1980s and into the 90s was that there was a ban on any symbols of Palestinian national identity um, in the art in the occupied territories. So they would set up art shows, and the police would come in and arrest the artists for anything that might be considered a symbol of Palestinian national identity, such as the Palestinian flag. So the joke was that you can't do a painting of a watermelon because a watermelon is red, white, black, and green. And the artists in these shows, and Suleiman in particular, went to jail a number of times so they could do art shows in the West Bank. Um, and Suleiman developed this strategy of using materials, local materials from the area, as a way of expressing national identity. So mud or sticks or whatever material was part of the West Bank. Um, and you can see Suleiman was very much influenced by sort of modernist notions of art, surrealism and abstraction, etc. Another artist who was working with Suleiman at the time was Taysir Barakat. Um, Taysir developed this um, style of art where he would burn images into olive wood. Of course, the olive tree being the tree which is raised in Palestine, the crop that's raised in Palestine. So, olive wood being a symbol of national identity. And he would burn images onto the wood and used created a lot of imagery this way, some of which is very spooky and beautiful. Um, And of course, using local materials is also a way to avoid buying art supplies, most of which would have been manufactured in Israel. So it's also a form of boycott that artists were engaged in. In some of Taysir's more recent work, you can see he goes back to a more conventional type of painting, um, and does some very beautiful work that looks somewhat cubist or sort of early modernist. He did a whole series of paintings about people being lost at sea. We've had the situation of refugees crowded into boats, dying, trying to get to Europe. And he did a number of paintings about this, and always doing paintings about the collective situation of Palestinian people. This is one of his paintings about the attack on Gaza. Okay, not to dwell exclusively on artists in Palestine. Lila Attar was a young woman, an art student in Iraq, and in the 1990s, um, she was awarded. She was seen as a really good up and coming talent, was invited to the capital city to live there and, given scholarships, and people were very excited about her work. And then, of course, Bill Clinton ordered the bombing of the capital city in Iraq, and Lila Attar happened to be under those bombs and died. So her career as an artist was cut short very early. Okay, Magdi al-Shafee is seen as the father of the Arab language graphic novel. He did a graphic novel called Metro, A Story of Cairo, which was a thriller, a crime story, um, but nonetheless had political implications. Um, Magdi set out to do this crime story very much set in Cairo. He very much wanted it to be the Arab story, the Egyptian story. So you have all of these very specific things about the city of Cairo, such as the metro system and actual stops in different places, very specifically laid out in the comic book. Um, he also, for his fight scenes, um, paid attention to um, Egyptian stick fighting, which is, I guess, a form of dance, right?
Yeah,
It's not,
it's actually stick dancing,
it,
and it goes back to ancient times. We have reliefs and Egyptian tombs of the stick dance, but it's a mock a mock battle. They pretend to fight each other, but it's a dance.
But you can see in his fight scenes, he basically has people doing what looks like stick dancing.
Yeah.
So again, he's trying to make this book as Egyptian as possible. So Metro is a crime story about two young men who are computer programmers but can't seem to make any money. They're deeply in debt because the society is so corrupt they can't seem to get any work or get anywhere. And they finally decide their only hope is to rob a bank. And when they break into the bank, they find in the vault there's this politician who is receiving a suitcase full of money in the basement of the bank. And they're about to take the money, and the politician says, "No, wait. If you work with me, I can get you even more money than that. If you just cooperate with me." And the hero of this story says, "Even an honest robbery turns to filth with you." So one might think this would get um, would get Magdi in trouble with the authorities in Mubarak's Egypt, and in fact, it did. Um, the book was banned. But Magdi has said that's not the reason the book got banned. There's another scene, and again, this is a completely fictional book. There's a scene where there's a protest in Tahrir Square, and this was done years before what we call the Arab Spring happened. But Tahrir Square was where people usually had demonstrations. And there's a scene where a politician um, pays some hoodlums to beat up and sexually harass the women who were protesting. And Magdi felt this was the reason the book was banned, because even though this was a fictional scene, this was what they were actually doing. So he was describing a process that was very familiar to Egyptians and a process that the government didn't want discussed. Um, and so, in a way, the most controversial thing you can very often do is to describe what actually goes on and what the actual processes are by which things work. So the book was banned under Mubarak. Um, so this is a cover Magdi el-Shafee did for our magazine, World War III Illustrated, and you can see um, it's a wraparound cover with, the front being our title and the back being in Arabic, our title, more or less. Not quite translated right. Um, and so this is a comic strip Magdi did after Mubarak was overthrown, and he did this for our magazine. Um, and what do you know? Um, the new government, the government of the Muslim Brotherhood, also arrested Magdi and also threw Magdi in jail because he was in the middle of protests in Tahrir Square, which continued during the period of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they decided to throw him in jail, and there was a big international campaign to keep bad things from happening to him in jail, and he was therefore very quickly released. And when the next government came in and overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood, um, Magdi's charges were dropped. And so what Magdi said to a class of my students was, um, Mubarak threw Magdi in jail. Mubarak is gone. Morsi threw Magdi in jail. Morsi is gone. So the new government knows you shouldn't really throw Magdi in jail. Um, However, his book is still not available in Arabic. It's still banned. Okay? It's still not comfortable to publish this in Arabic. It is available in German, it is available in French, and it is available in English. It is not printed in Arabic. Metro is not printed in Arabic. Um, Magdi is working on a new book set during the British occupation of Egypt. Gee, I wonder why. So he's doing a historical book like nobody can say in Egypt that, hey, you're being too hard on the British here. So he's not
Yeah.
doing a book about
Yeah.
contemporary Egypt at the moment.
Yeah, the British are not popular in Egypt.
Yeah. So, okay, that's what he's doing now. Um, so this is the work he's doing right now. Another artist connected to the protests in Tahrir Square was el-Nnadi. And this is a picture of el-Nnadi sitting in Tahrir Square during the protest, and he's drawing this character he's come up with called the Dog of the Police. Um, and he was arrested many times, jailed many times, and did political cartoons connected to the movement of that time. This is one of his drawings about the movement around Tahrir Square, and he's got, the image of the revolution's youth, and then everyone trying to tell them what to do. Um, do what the Muslim Brotherhood says, do what the Pope says, do what the military council says, do what the elites say.
Can I point out that the Pope is not the Catholic Pope, but the Coptic Pope,
There you
the
go.
Egyptian Coptic Pope?
There you go.
Hmm.
So this is a cover that Nnadi did for a magazine during the period that Morsi was president. And what you see is the leaders of all the different political factions in Egypt, and they're all naked, and each of them has a glass of blood. And Morsi, who is, of course, the president supported by the Muslim Brotherhood, is standing behind them saying, "Don't worry, the blood is halal." And this cover was put out, and the magazine was seized immediately and shut down immediately for having this cover the day it came out. This is my favorite Nnadi cartoon. Um, you see Mubarak on the right and Morsi in the middle, and Sisi, the current ruler of Egypt, on the left. And of course, people in the Middle East do read from right to left. And you can see that the dog of the police is always there, no matter who the president is. So that's my favorite Nnadi cartoon. So during the Arab Spring, you had a whole lot of murals painted in Cairo
And graffiti.
and graffiti on pretty amazing stuff. Some by artists we know, some by artists we don't know, but there was tons of it. And thank you to Tamara for taking a lot of these photos when she was in Cairo. So these are martyr paintings. These are paintings of people who were killed either by the police or by various political factions during the struggle in Tahrir Square. And martyr paintings were very, very common in the period of the Arab Spring. So you can see in this picture, everybody has little wings because
Because
they're
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 dead.
going to heaven. These are also martyr paintings, and the original martyr paintings, people were made to look very attractive, but the artist who painted these was very unhappy with the direction of the new government, so he went back to the martyr paintings and painted them so that their injuries were very visible, to make them more disturbing, because he felt the martyrs were not being respected. This is by Ganzir, and Ganzir told me that when he painted the tank, the military thought it was a pro-military painting, so they let him paint this entire tank, and then he put the little guy on the bicycle in front of the tank, and they realized, oh shit, it wasn't a pro-military painting. Um, so Ganzir did a lot of street art during the Arab Spring. He did a number of stencils. Here's a stencil of the cat, which of course the cat is a symbol of Egypt. Um,
The ancient
the, the
Egyptian goddess.
the ancient Egyptian goddess Bastet. And of course, here the cat has been injured, so Egypt has been injured. Um, more stuff by Ganzir. Of course, this is Mubarak not looking very attractive. This building is the building which the state media was run out of, the state TV station, the state radio that people who were protesting in Tahrir Square felt that the state media was lying about them, so that you'll see a lot of graffiti and stencil art protesting against the state media.
So
Uh,
those stencils were all over Cairo. Lots of people making stencils and spray painting them all over the place.
yeah. So this is a back cover Ganzir did for our magazine as the Arab Spring came to its end and very violent end. There's a martyr painting by Ganzir. Um, this is a painting that was part of an art show by Ganzir. And apparently, the full Arabic script, it's a picture of a woman in a hijab and in her underwear. And apparently, the full Arabic script reads, "I pray to God that He will send me a husband who knows how to give me an orgasm." And for doing that painting, Ganzir received death threats from Muslim extremists who would call him up or send him emails and say, "We're going to kill you, that you've profaned Islam with this painting." And in spite of that, when the new government came in, the al-Sisi government, there was a news report on TV reporting that Ganzir was in fact an employee of the Muslim Brotherhood. At which point Ganzir said, I think I'd rather be in the United States. And he came here and actually has done quite well in the United States. He did an animation for a video by the band U2, and he came out with a graphic novel called The Solar Grid, which has won awards and is a very respected graphic novel series, The Solar Grid. So he's done quite well in the United States, but he's not living in Egypt at the moment. Okay, Icy and Sot. Were Iranian graffiti artists. You can see here very much influenced by Banksy and their particular way of using stencil art. Um, and Icy and Sot eventually decided that living in Iran was not such a safe thing, and they're now living in Brooklyn and they're doing art here. Um, This is Mazen Karbaj, who's Lebanese, and he's both a comic book artist, an illustrator, and an experimental jazz musician. And during the um, Israeli assault on Lebanon, he recorded an album standing on his roof, playing his saxophone while the bombs were being dropped around him. And this was the album cover he made for his album. And this is a comic strip that Mazen Karbaj did about the issue of the imposition of the veil on Muslim women, and making his own comment about that, where these women are up to their eyes in water. They're hidden below the water. Um, it's a very kind of interesting and beautiful and poetic metaphor. So this is his own protest against Islamic extremism. Ali Ferzat is Syrian, and even though Syria had this dictatorship for generations, um, apparently early in his career, um, the Assad dictatorship kind of liked Ali Ferzat and let him do what he wanted and let him do whatever cartoons he wanted. And he did some very strong political cartoons like this one. And then one day he did this cartoon. And in this cartoon, you can see Gaddafi is splitting town and Assad is trying to hitch a ride with him. So the idea is Gaddafi has fallen from power and Assad is next. And Assad supporters didn't like that cartoon very much. So he was beaten up. Farzad was beaten up, and apparently from his hospital bed, he did this drawing.
I love that.
So this is what it means to be a political cartoonist in a country like the country Syria was for many years. Um, it's not touch football. It's a contact sport. It's a blood sport to be a political cartoonist in a country like this. Um, okay, Sajjad was in Kashmir. Now, is Kashmir part of the Middle East? Is it part of the Muslim world? Is it part of the Arab world? Whatever. But this is done about the same time as the cartoons about the Arab Spring were done, and its content is very similar. Okay. Kashmir obviously is a country in which a territory in which the majority of people are Muslim, but it's ruled by India and it's ruled by Hindus. Okay, and Malik Sajjad is speaking for people in the Muslim community. Did this comic strip about being arrested for a Facebook post. Um, that, he heard about, protesters being shot in the street from his friend, and he posted the images of that on Facebook. And the next thing you know, he was thrown in jail for the Facebook post. So this is a comic strip about that. It's a very typical experience of that period. Okay, he's also done a graphic novel called Munu, a boy from Kashmir. And in this book, he portrays the Muslims of Kashmir as this type of animal, some kind of elk. I'm not sure what the animal is,
Gazelle.
but they're all portrayed as this animal. And, he shows their oppression
It's
as,
a kind of deer.
the animal?
It's a kind of deer that is native to Kashmir.
Okay, okay. Anyways, all the Muslims are this animal, and he shows the ways that they're oppressed. And in a lot of ways, it resembles Art Spiegelman's mouse, right? So one could say it's a little derivative, but it's also, I think, his way of saying, look, the world can look at Art Spiegelman's mouse and understand the situation of Jewish people during World War II. I would like the world to treat the situation of Muslims in Kashmir with the same seriousness. So I'm going to do a book very much like Maus about my community. Okay, Musa Kart is in Turkey. Is Turkey in the Middle East? Is Turkey in the Muslim world? Is Turkey in the Arab world? Um, Nonetheless, here we are. Musakar does a picture of the president of the country, ignoring some bank robbers, and Musakart is thrown in jail. Okay. Gee, this is familiar. This is a familiar set of moves here, right? Very similar to Magdi el-Shafee, the bank robbers, the president, the jail, really similar sort of thing. Um, Bayanyani is a feminist comic book from Turkey, and it's been running for a number of years. Okay, so there are a number of artists who are not living in these countries, but who write about these countries and are from these countries. Marjane Satrapi did this amazing series of books called Persepolis that are about her experience growing up in Iran, and then having to leave and coming to France. And they're really beautiful, moving books. What I should stress, though, is Marjane did these entirely for a French audience. These were never distributed in Iran. They were never part of any Iranian comics industry whatsoever. They're part of the French comic book industry. So it's great work. Should all read it. Really funny, really beautiful. I love Marjan, but there's a difference between what Marjan was doing and the other artists I've been showing you, who were doing their art within the context of the countries they're writing about. Um, Another amazing cartoonist, Jennifer Camper, is Arab American, uh, gay cartoonist, um, has done comics for the gay newspapers for like 40 years, really smart, witty comics. After 9/11, Jennifer started writing about being an Arab American, and her identity as an Arab American, and has done really smart, witty, effective comics about this. But again, Jennifer is writing for, drawing for an American queer audience, not an audience of people back in Lebanon, you know? Um, she's working entirely for an audience here. Samia Halabi, an abstract painter, um, Palestinian, who's been living in the United States since the 40s, I think. I think she studied with Ben Shahn, so that's a long time ago. Um, and is very successful as an abstract painter. She teaches at either Yale or Harvard, I can't remember which. She's a very, very successful painter. All her work is abstract. Nonetheless, a show of her work at Indiana University, which was her alma mater, was shut down after October 7th because it was felt that these abstract paintings would create a hostile environment for Jewish students. That Jewish students just can't go to college in front of abstract paintings by a Palestinian. Um, so this is the level of repression that's been directed against Palestinian artists since October 7th, even if their work is totally abstract. Um, Palestinian artist who's living in Brazil, whose work is not particularly abstract, is Latouf, who does really, straight up political cartooning about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Lives in Brazil. His stuff is circulated online all over the world. Latouf very much likes to use in his cartoons the comparison of the situation of Palestinians to the situation of Jews in Nazi Germany. Um, and that creates a lot of conflict. This is a cartoon Latouf did, which was posted on the online platform of Israel Indie Media in I think 2002 or 2003, back when we had indie media centers. Some of you will remember the indie media centers, which were usually like a big loft with tons of computers where people would get political information out to the world from a particular city. So Israel Indie Media was, because this cartoon was on their website, Israel Indie Media was raided by the police and all the computers were seized because this cartoon of Sharon, the president of Israel, kissing Hitler, was seen as a misuse of Holocaust imagery, which is against the law in Israel. There is a law against misusing Holocaust imagery, and this was used to bust everybody at Israel Indie Media because Latouf posted this image. So that's an interesting law, right? Um, it's interesting that Israel has a law against misusing Holocaust imagery because when I was in Israel in, I think, 2003, this poster was everywhere I went. And this is a poster by the Israeli far right. Um, and there, it says, "Stop the roadmap to Auschwitz." And of course, the roadmap was at that point George W. Bush's proposed plan for a two-state solution. or his plan to get to a two-state solution. So um, they're comparing the U.S. role in negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Authority to Auschwitz.
Mm.
And they're putting this poster up all over Israel. And I did not hear about the Lubavitchers being busted for misuse of Holocaust imagery for putting up this poster.
Mm.
So clearly, certain laws are used in a selective manner.
Mm.
Okay. Um, but that brings us to the question. I've been showing you all of this artwork by all of these Arab and Muslim artists, and you're like, okay, you're talking about the Middle East, Seth. Are you going to say anything about Israeli artists? So, okay, I will. I will. Um, let's start with the fact that Israeli society is not a monolith. So let me digress into politics a little bit here. Um, so there's been disagreement in Israel as long as there's been Israel. Mott's Pen was a small group of Israeli intellectuals in the 1960s and 70s who were opposed to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Um, they wanted Israel to withdraw to the pre-67 borders. And in the founding document of their organization, they said that they were anti-capitalist, anti-Stalinist, and anti-Zionist. And I've seen photographs of these guys getting beaten up with 2x4s in the public square for having these positions. You know, not funny. And they were eventually charged with espionage simply for visiting Syria. Um, there was a group called the Israeli Black Panthers, who have nothing to do with the American Black Panthers, except that they were organizing in the same period and clearly liked the literature of the Black Panther Party.
Were they
Um,
black?
the Israeli Black Panthers were Mizrahi. Mizrahi Jews were Jews who were expelled from the Arab countries in response to Israel expelling Palestinians. So they were Jews who might have come from Egypt or Syria or Yemen, um, forced to leave with whatever they could carry and moved into Israeli society. And guess what? They spoke Arabic, they had dark skin, they listened to Arab style music, and people were like, who the fuck are these guys? And they were discriminated against in Israeli society. In fact, there was a period of time when it was illegal for them to have a radio station that played Mizrahi style music. So they formed the organization Israeli Black Panthers to advocate for their rights in that situation. Um, Dear Yassin was an Israeli punk band in the 1980s and 90s, who did a lot of work to advocate draft resistance during the war with Lebanon. Um, Here's a couple of their album covers. And of course, Deir Yassin, people will remember, was the name of a village in which, in 1948, Israeli militias or Zionist militias massacred the population. So by calling their band Deir Yassin, they were making sure that people were aware of that history. So here you can see a picture where um, a man is being forced to fight another man in a kind of oddly classical style. Um, Here's one of their album covers. And here's the text that goes with these pictures on the album cover. Pictures of soldiers and children of the Intifada belong to the pantheon of the international journalistic photography. Their power was that each time we saw one, we knew that more very similar pictures would be taken in a few moments, hours, and upcoming days. In these pictures, which portray endless variations of the same human situation, a child throwing a stone, a soldier shooting into the crowd, was also an element of hope because they were a perfect expression of rebellion and oppression. In some of them, the battle resembled an allegoric dance, a sort of theatrical catharsis, which after it, the expected end will follow, a choice between life and death, between the end of the occupation and the end of the lie. In the eyes of the children, pride glittered, and in the soldiers' faces reflected embarrassment, sometimes even shame. Remember, at the top of their priorities, the establishment and their PR agents had only one sole goal: to make people forget the David and Goliath situation, which is invoked by the pictures, and to convince the world that the pictures lie, that they have said Palestinians feel contempt for human life and send their children to die in order to blacken Israel's reputation. They have also said that we shouldn't forgive the Arab children, those sadists, for forcing pure Israeli children soldiers to kill them. What haven't they told in order to combat these pictures? What haven't they invented as to cover them up in a smokescreen of lies? So that was Dear Yassin, a band in the 1980s and 90s, an Israel punk band. Um, Later on, there was a group called Anarchists Against the Wall, and these were people who were opposed to the building of the apartheid wall or the separation barrier, whatever you want to call it, the wall around the West Bank. These were Israeli anarchists. A number of them were shot protesting the building of these barriers. And of course, today there continue to be protests against the war in Gaza in Israel all the time. So that's just a little bit of the complexity of Israeli society politically. Um, Now, as to the artwork, that's another story. Um, Not all of the artwork is that complex. This is Kirill Gardosh, who was a popular cartoonist at the time of the Six-Day War, and he portrayed this image of the Israeli kibbutznik with the little hat, which we all associate with the kibbutz, and what a tough little guy he is, how he's David fighting Goliath, and he defeated all the Arab states, and makes a big joke out of that. He was a very popular cartoonist in Israel and a very popular cartoonist with Jewish people all over the world at that time. This is Dudu Geva, who is a very popular cartoonist in Israel. Um, did mostly children's comics. Created a character called Joseph the Duck. And interestingly, in 1991, Dudu Geva was sued by Disney Corporation because they said that Joseph the Duck looked too much like Donald Duck. And so they sued them. They sued him for this issue of the magazine. And this actually created a lot of debate in Israeli society about the question of whether Israel actually had its own culture or whether it was simply a derivation of American culture, because it was possible that this was close enough to Donald Duck to sue the guy. Dudu Gaba did some other more interesting things later on, um, that tried to deal in a more complex way with the political situation. Here's a cartoon that I think is pretty interesting, and I'll read part of it to you. It's long, so I don't have the whole thing translated, but I have a couple panels translated. 1 year to the beginning of the first Intifada, and everything is as usual. I became accustomed to living with it, as if nothing had happened. Besides, I got used to lots of other things in the past decade. I predict an expansion in my ability to adapt. My capacity to take up anything is unlimited, and I shall be proud to prove that. Transfer Palestinians out of the country? No problem. A nuclear bomb? Not even a blink. So that's an expression of what a lot of us call the normalization of the occupation. Here's an artist of the next generation, Ronan Idleman, also doing a comic strip, which is in a way about normalization. Um, and it's a comic he wrote about his own experience in the military during the war with Lebanon. And I show this to my students a lot because it's one of the most interesting military comics I've ever seen. You know, military stories are usually about like some guys in a trench and they're dirty and they're getting shot at and they're scared. And this portrays service in the military in a much different way. In this story, Ronan is basically working in an office and reading coordinates into a phone, which tells people where to point their weapons, where to point their missiles, and where to fire them. That's his job in the military is read off these coordinates. And it turns out he gave them the wrong coordinates and they blew up a village instead of blowing up their enemies. And um, people don't even want to tell him this. He's like, um, any results? Did we hit them? What do you care? Go on, tell us. Some idiot from artillery misaimed by over a mile. We killed a woman and a baby. So they didn't even want to tell him that he made this mistake. And so, okay, what's going to happen to him? He's committed a war crime, right? And what happens is that the media completely covers it up. There's no mention of it. And his father is very proud of him for his military service. So that is an expression also of a feeling of great distress about the normalization of this violence. Um, Ronan did not continue drawing comics. He apparently was not that interested in drawing and was more interested in ideas. So here he's done a détournement of an old kibbutz poster where the character seems to be squinting in the sun, and it has the quote from Gandhi, an eye for an eye and the world goes blind. And he began to do conceptual art projects. While he was in Germany, he created a conceptual art project of demanding a Jewish state in the middle of Germany and selecting a province that was underpopulated and drawing up papers to propose that this country, called Thuringen, should be made a Jewish state. So that was one of his conceptual art projects. Returning to Israel, he created another conceptual art project in which Jewish Israelis who were allowed to vote could use an app to give their votes to Palestinians in the West Bank who are not allowed to vote in Israeli elections but are affected by the results. Okay, after October 7th, um, Ronan and a number of Israeli artists put together this joint statement in response to something that was an art form, which was an open letter from um, the art community um, call, calling for trying to prevent the attack on Gaza. And they, in their open letter, they pointed out that in the open letter printed in art forum, there was no mention of October 7th. There was no mention of the situation of Israelis, and they wanted to know why they weren't included, and their concerns weren't included in this open letter. The result of this controversy created by the open letter was that Artforum fired their editor. Okay. And Ronan was, I think, actually very upset about this because he said he was never trying to get that guy fired. He was trying to develop some kind of dialogue with the arts community and the rest of the world, that he supported most of what was in that letter. He just didn't support the fact that the concerns of the Israeli left were left out of it. Um, so Michael Mishrazanov is also an Israeli cartoonist who's done a lot of work attacking the current government and satirizing the current government. Um, he did this cartoon at a time when they decided they wanted to ban the Palestinian flag. and, showing all kinds of people wearing the Palestinian flag. Um, he did cartoons about gay and trans rights in Israel. After October 7th, he did a series of illustrations about what to do in an event where you have experienced something traumatic, and these were translated into many different languages. Um, he came up with this poster for the current movement in Israel, which is the movement demanding the return of the hostages and the end to the war. And I don't know whether Michael Rosanov came up with the hourglass as the symbol of that movement, or whether he adopted that symbol from the movement. But this is a poster of the hourglass, which is the symbol of the Israeli anti-war movement right now. The idea that time is running out for the people who were held hostage. And here's a piece he did after three escaping hostages were actually killed by the Israeli military, who mistook them for Palestinians. So you see the three X's on the guy's gun for the three people they killed. Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi is an Israeli painter who is an immigrant from Ukraine. Like a big part of the current Israeli population are immigrants. It's a settler society. And so a lot of her paintings are somewhat autobiographical. This is a painting about growing up in Ukraine when it was part of Russia under the Soviet Union. And some of you may know this, that um, while during the Stalin period, possession of any literature or music that was not approved could land you in jail. Khrushchev changed that to say that you could have whatever literature you wanted in your home, you just couldn't distribute it. So people had extensive collections of music and books in their own homes, and they basically partied in their apartments. And so this is a piece about Zoya's childhood, and it has a great title, which is Anarchy Was Our Mother. And as an immigrant to Israel, Zoya uh, was exposed to the fact that a big part of the immigrant community in Israel is coming from Africa, and particularly Ethiopia. So she did a lot of paintings about Ethiopian immigrants. And as someone who came from Ukraine, she did paintings about the war in Ukraine when it started. And since October 7th, she's become known for paintings about the way people felt about the October 7th attack. Um, this is a particularly powerful piece. Do people recognize that light in the middle? Do people see where that came from?
From Guernica.
It's from the Guernica. So, this was one of her pieces in response to October 7th, where there's this terrified family and there's the eye from the Guernica in the middle of it. Um, okay, Israeli artists, all kinds of people in Israel. Also all kinds of people in other places. And I thought I should talk a little bit about how American, European, and Canadian artists portray the situation in the Middle East, because this is more and more something we're seeing. We're seeing more and more artists. In fact, people in this class want to do artwork about the Middle East, don't you? So let's look at some of the ways that the Middle East has been portrayed here, and to what extent that has also been censored. Okay, racist caricatures of Arabs are really common in American cartooning. I'm certainly not going to go through lots of different artists who did that. There'd be more than I could count. What I will tell you is this, that when I started working at newspapers in the 1980s, it would not have been cool to do a racist caricature of Louis Farrakhan. It would not have been cool to do an anti-Semitic caricature of Golda Meir. But it was perfectly okay to do a racist caricature of Yasser Arafat, Muammar Gaddafi, or any other Arab you wanted to. It was perfectly okay. Lots of people did these drawings. Did they do these drawings because they were vicious racists? No, they did these drawings because they could sell them to the press, which was perfectly willing to publish them. There was no attempt to avoid racial caricature of Arabs in the American press until very, very recently. Okay.
Seth,
Yeah.
does this include the New Yorker and the New York Times,
It, um,
or do you not know?
I would have to check that. It
Okay,
would certainly include other papers, and um, I would have to check that. Um, I'm not sure.
okay, thank you.
So I worked for a syndicate. I worked for the United Features Syndicate, and we sent cartoons out to 20 different papers every week. And guys I worked with did, anti-Arab caricatures, and that work was bought. And it was sent to a long list of papers, and nobody ever had a problem with it. Okay?
Right.
So I'm just saying it was. So that's as much as I need to say about that. Um, Let me talk about people who were not trying to do anti-Arab caricatures, and starting with our own magazine, World War III Illustrated, where um, we were against the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, and all of the interventions in the Middle East from the beginning of our magazine. So we were not trying to do anti-Arab artwork. Um, And we, in fact, published an interview with Naji Ali right after his assassination. Um, it was published in World War III Illustrated number 10 in early 1988. Um, and because we were publishing that, a number of the artists decided that they would try to do some type of cartoon about the Middle East. And I think this piece by Eric Drucker um, is really interesting and really impressive in relation to the history I've been showing you. So I'm going to read it. Once upon a time, a little boy named David killed a giant named Goliath, hit him right between the eyes, and little David was made king, and the Philistines were free to work on King David's farm. The king was well fed and grew bigger every day. One day, a small boy slung a stone at the king, who shot the little boy through the heart. And the king ordered his soldiers to break all the little boy's hands so they could never throw stones at him ever again. So in this cartoon, along with, portraying the situation we were all seeing in media, which was that, you know, Palestinian kids with stones were confronting Israeli soldiers with guns and getting shot. He's also going back to, this myth of Zionism of, you know, Israel being David versus Goliath. And he's re-examining that myth. So, Eric clearly, knows the history, knows the imagery, and is reinterpreting that imagery. So I think it's a really effective piece even now. I think it stands the test of time. Peter Cooper also did a piece about having lived on a kibbutz when he was a kid, like a lot of us. You know, our families took us to Israel in the 1960s. It was a very popular thing for middle-class Jewish American families to do. So he wrote about his first impressions and his subsequent disillusionment with Israel. Tom Keogh, to my knowledge, is the first American cartoonist to travel to the occupied territories and do a comic strip about it. Um, he went there in 1987. Um, there was a um, there was a group of Methodist ministers who were investigating the Israel-Palestine conflict because they were trying to decide whether mutual funds they were managing should invest in Israeli businesses. Okay, they were managing people's retirement accounts, and they had felt they had an obligation to only make moral investments. So they wanted to go to Palestine and find out what was going on, and they were not allowed to bring cameras into the occupied territories. So they brought Tom, who did a comic strip illustrating what he found there and showed, all the violence done to children by the occupation. He also described the Intifada as this mass uprising in which people did all kinds of civil disobedience, not just violence. So he also defined the word Intifada, which of course has become a very controversial word over the last 2 years in the United States, but defined it in the original way it was intended as an uprising, popular uprising that people participated in many different ways. Um, Okay, so in 1993, Joe Sacco's Palestine was published by Fantagraphics. It was published first as a series of magazines and then later collected as a book. Um, Joe Sacco's Palestine is enormously influential. It's read all over the world. It's really, for a lot of people, the go-to source of information about Palestine. And Joe is very respected by people in the occupied territories, and you can see that by some of his comics where he gets to places that are very hard to get to, that clearly somebody in the Palestinian community had to help him go to that place so he could do that piece of reportage. Um, so Joe Sacco's been very important. Um, he tends to present himself not as an advocate for Palestinians, but as a journalist in the tradition of, you know, um, you know, people who've been to journalism school in the tradition of mass media journalists who are supposedly neutral or objective. Um, although and he will do things like an interview with a rather than state his opinion about what happened, he'll do an interview with someone where they'll tell him what happened you know um Now people have said, okay, come on, Joe, you're showing one side of the story. um and he deals with that in one of his comic series. Says, you know someone says, "You've been here for 2 months and you haven't been to Tel Aviv. Shouldn't you be seeing our side of the story too?" And he says, "And what can I say? I say I've heard nothing but the Israeli side most all my life, that it'd take a whole other trip to see Israel, that I'd like to meet Israelis, but that wasn't why I was here." So he kind of makes an excuse for this. You know, he doesn't admit that he has a particular political agenda. He says, "I'm a journalist and I'm trying to get this untold story of the Palestinian side of the conflict." Um, so again, he wants to present himself as a journalist and not as an advocate. He does great work, important work. Um, we can all learn from what Joe does. Um, Miriam Libicki is a Canadian citizen who, God bless her heart, decided to give 3 years of her life to the Israeli military, and then wrote a series of comics about being in the Israeli military called Jobnik. I have to say I couldn't get through Jobnik. I didn't like the drawing style and I found the writing kind of boring. So I can't tell you whether Jobnik is good or bad because I didn't really read it. Because I read about 4 pages and put it down. However, she did a second project that I thought was interesting called Toward a Hot Jew. And this is not a book about the Israeli military. It's a book about the semiotics of the Israeli military, about what the image of the Israeli soldier means to Jews all over the world, and the way it affects their self-image to have this fantasy notion of the Israeli soldier. I thought this was a really interesting project um, that Miriam Libicki did. Um, Eli Valley deals with a lot of the same thing. Eli Valley writes for the Jewish Daily Forward, which is a very progressive Jewish American paper um, that has long been part of the left. And he does this whole series where he's satirizing the kind of cult of Israeli machismo that's a big part of the American Jewish community. So he has Israel man and diaspora boy, like the idea that Jews who do not become Israelis, who do not become Zionists, who live here are somehow these fallen creatures, these, you know, um, impotent, ugly little Woody Allen people versus these big, strong Israeli heroic guys, right? So he does a lot of satire on this and does very powerful satire on this. Ethan Heitner, who helped me put together this slideshow, has done a lot of cartoons promoting the idea of boycott, divestment, and sanction. And he's been very politically active and has also been very active in getting the work of Arab and Palestinian cartoonists seen all over the world. Um, Andy Singer is a political cartoonist who's done some recent work about the Israel-Palestine conflict and who works for a lot of mainstream publications and a lot of syndications and a lot of newspapers. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is a lot of cartoonists who don't normally deal with Israel-Palestine jumping into the discussion and finding out what happens when you do. So this is Andy's account of what happened when he did some cartoons about the Israel-Palestine conflict. He says, "When it comes to religion, I'm agnostic. I never went to Hebrew school or studied the Torah, but Judaism is part of my heritage. So I've had to think about it and my relationship to Israel since I was a little kid. As a political cartoonist, it's my job to call out hypocrisy and point out ways in which governments or private interests are harming people and the planet. I frequently drew cartoons critical of U.S. foreign and domestic policies, and sometimes I get attacked for them. But even when they disagree with me, editors and public critics don't question my right to state opinions. For a long time, I approached cartooning about Israel the same way. I assumed my Jewish heritage insulated me from accusations of anti-Semitism. This was before September of 2003, when I drew a cartoon about the giant walls that Israel was building in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. At that time, I had over 20 newspapers that regularly published my cartoons. Several of them ran the cartoon about Israel on their editorial page. This included 3 weekly papers in the San Francisco Bay Area belonging to the Hills newspaper group, the Berkeley Voice, the Alameda Journal, and the Montclarian. Within a day of publication, a pro-Israeli group created a form email letter for its members to send to the newspapers accusing me of anti-Semitism and all sorts of other horrors. The publisher also received calls and pressure to fire me. Within a month, they fired me. A short while later, they fired my editor. So this is the type of experience that Andy Singer had. Um, Another cartoonist who uses the pen name Mr. Fish. Um, his name is actually Dwayne Booth. Um, was denounced at the university he teaches for having done this cartoon, um, which again he was being denounced for being anti-Semitic because he did this cartoon. So they're all drinking glasses of blood, and there's a dove in the background, and the people drinking the blood say, "Who invited that lousy anti-Semite?" So I guess people decided that Dwayne Booth was the lousy anti-Semite for doing this cartoon. So, that type of pressure exists. It's nothing on the scale of what happens to people in the Middle East. People are not being assassinated. People are not being imprisoned. Um, Newspapers are not being shut down. Books are not being banned. But yes, some people have been fired from their jobs for doing cartoons critical of Israel. Nonetheless, more and more people are doing this, and there is both a website and a magazine called Cartoonists for Palestine that a number of people work with. And Art Spiegelman has just done his own comic strip critical of Israel he did in collaboration with Joe Sacco. It ran in the New York Review of Books, and I'm proud to say will also run in the next issue of World War III Illustrated. And a few panels from this are interesting. Um, he shows Netanyahu up to his waist in eyeballs, and noting the line from the Bible. The Bible says an eye for an eye, and he says yes, but Netanyahu is an overachiever. Um, He says, I didn't make Maus to teach anyone anything. I wasn't making Auschwitz for beginners, and I do not want Maus to ever be used as a recruiting poster for the Israeli army. He also says this, which is, I think, within the Jewish community in the United States, a very daring thing to say. It made sense for Jews to want a homeland, but Israel may be a failed experiment. And he then shows you his cartoon version of the failed experiment, where this family is being sold this apartment, and the salesman says, an apartment without people for people without an apartment. And of course, the apartment is actually filled with people. So he ends with an image of Armageddon, which is actually a Christian religious image, has nothing to do with Judaism, but is sort of how a lot of people may feel right now, that the world is going to hell. Um, and then he also ends with, the whole piece is a conversation between Joe Sacco and Art Spiegelman, and they say, Art, it may take bigger brains than ours to find a just solution. And the Art says, yeah, a just solution would be way better than a final solution. So in the end, Artie sort of backs off of saying, here's what I think should happen. He does not take that particular risk, although he's taken the risk of showing all this other stuff. So it's very interesting that he did this, and I've been monitoring it for the last month or so. What was the reaction to this comic strip? And as far as I can see, the only place he's been denounced as an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew have been on right-wing websites. Nobody else seems to be all that bothered by this comic strip. So we're in a different time than we were in the past. I think that's evident. So another publication I'd like to talk about and what they say about the Middle East is who I started out talking about, which is Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo is kind of interesting on this subject because for many, many years, the cartoonists in Charlie Hebdo were very pro-Palestinian. Okay, here's a cartoon where this Palestinian guy is getting beaten up by the big Israeli fist, and he says, and now you still recognize Palestine, as in, recognizing a state or recognizing a person's face after they've been beaten to the point where you can't recognize them. That's a pretty strong statement, right? I don't think you could have run that in an American newspaper, but it was in Charlie Hebdo, the satirical French newspaper we're talking about. Here he's got, the Palestinian has his bombs, and the settler has his settlements. Here's a cartoon against racist immigration laws. Gee, we could use that now, right? Um, Here's a cartoon against Nazi skinheads in the National Front. So, okay, Charlie Hebdo's a pretty left-wing and pretty pro-Arab French magazine. You know, not exactly who you'd expect to be in the trouble they got into. Okay, I think where this begins is that there's a very strong anti-clerical tendency in the French left, and particularly the particular generation of French cartoonists that Charlie Hebdo is part of. And they see themselves as against all religions. They saw themselves as equal opportunity offenders. Unfortunately, that's not how people responded to them, and there might be a reason for that. I think that there's some insensitivity on their part as well. Um, this is a cartoon they published in response to French laws about um, face coverings. France passed a law against people having any mask in a public place. So you could not wear a burqa on a street in France. A Muslim woman could not wear a burqa anywhere. There's also a law against wearing hijab in public schools. You cannot wear any form of religious attire in a French public school. Both of these are very much felt by French Muslims as as religious discrimination against them. So Charlie Hebdo did this rude cartoon where the um, woman is naked and she's wearing her headscarf in her butt and saying, "That's where I want the headscarf." Okay. Um, so this is pretty gross, and it's gloating about a situation in which the French Muslim community felt like they were being discriminated against. And it's gloating, and it's gloating in a pretty gross way. And okay, so people have said to me, well, shouldn't people say something about the fact that women are oppressed in Islam? Isn't that something that there should be comics about? Okay, so here's Mazen Karbaj, who lives in Lebanon and is Muslim and deals with this question all the time. Here's the way he satirizes it versus the way Charlie Hebdo satirized it. And I think this is a really good example of the difference between the way a person does art about their own community, who they understand and have compassion for, and the way a person does a satire about a community they're not a part of and don't have much compassion for. So I think you can see the difference here. Um, Now, this whole idea that Charlie Hebdo were equal opportunity offenders. Okay, one of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists named Sine did this cartoon of the Israeli flag made out of bones. And Charlie Hebdo would not run this in their magazine because they said it was anti-Semitic. And so he organized his own magazine called Cine Hebdo. Of course, Hebdo basically means weekly. Okay. So he put out his own magazine. So this idea that, you know, Charlie Hebdo just printed anything, no matter who it offended, not true. They were taking a political position that they decided to make an issue of their ability to do things that the Muslim community in France and in the world didn't like. Um, Here's one of the last pieces they did before the attack. And this is a piece about the fact that after Sisi became the dictator of Egypt, there was a protest by the Muslim Brotherhood in which um, over 100 supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood were shot down in the street. Okay? And what it says here is the Quran is shit because it doesn't stop bullets. So again, is this something you want to make a joke about? That 100 people, okay, maybe there are 100 people you disagree with. 100 people were shot down on the street for expressing their political opinion by a dictator. And you want to make a joke about that. Okay. So shortly after that, the staff of Charlie Hebdo were massacred, which is horrible. And shortly after that, a couple of French teenagers produced this. Charlie Hebdo is shit. It doesn't stop bullets. Again, that's pretty rude. But guess what? Those two kids were arrested as terrorism suspects for putting this out online.
Wow.
Okay. So clearly, that was treated differently. Um, so all of this is pretty horrible. Okay. And everybody was upset and should have been upset about the murdering of several progressive, creative, left-wing cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo. We all had a good reason to be upset about this. It's interesting that all kinds of people were suddenly concerned about Charlie Hebdo who never liked the magazine in the first place. In fact, Willem, one of the um, Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, said, "We vomit on those who suddenly declare that they were our friends," meaning all of the leading figures of French politics were suddenly coming out and supporting this magazine that had attacked them for decades. Okay? So this is a fucked up situation. It's bad and it's shocking. When something is shocking, it's shocking because we don't expect it. We don't expect it because it's unusual. And in this case, it's unusual because we still have some semblance of freedom of expression in the United States and Europe. And the problem is that in most of what we're calling the Middle East or the Arab world or the Muslim world or whatever the hell you want to call it, um, it's not unusual for a cartoonist to be shot, imprisoned, banned for their political expression. So I want to go back to some cartoonists who had to deal with some rough stuff. Abu Zubaydah is in Guantanamo. Abu Zubaydah has been in Guantanamo for years and has done drawings to document the torture he experiences in Guantanamo. Now, these cartoons cannot be published as art. They can only be published as evidence because the US government owns all the art produced by prisoners in Guantanamo. And the only reason we're seeing these is because their lawyer has submitted them as evidence of torture. Pretty amazing, way out, disturbing drawings, right? Okay, Mohammed Sabana was a cartoonist working for Arab newspapers, Palestinian newspapers in the West Bank, and working very much in the tradition of Naji al-Ali. And this is one of Muhammad's typical cartoons, right? Where, the olive from the olive tree turns into a grenade. Um, and then Muhammad was thrown in prison. And Muhammad has told me that his artwork improved enormously when he was in prison because he could no longer work on a computer and had to do everything with a pencil and paper. So he became a much better artist when he was imprisoned. And he was in prison for 5 months. And I think a lot of you will know that under Israeli law, they can hold somebody for an extended period of time without filing charges as a way to shake people down. So it's pretty normal for a young man in Palestine to spend a few months in the slammer, right? Um, and one thing that wasn't normal is that all over the world there were petitions to support Mohammed Sabana from the community of cartoonists all over the world. And so when Mohammed got out of prison, he said, you know, this comics thing, this cartoon thing, this drawing thing, it's a big deal. All these people wanted to support me. I'd better become a better artist. So anytime Mohammed has been in New York, we hit the museums. He went and looked at Picasso. He looked at all the art he could find and tried to become a much more sophisticated cartoonist. And I think advanced and expanded his work a great deal. Um, Here's an interesting cartoon that Mohammed Sabana did. This is a picture of the Prophet Muhammad um, raining love on the world. And it was printed in a Palestinian newspaper who he said didn't quite understand what he'd sent them. And since then, he's had death threats from Islamic extremists because, yes, Mohammed Sabana did a picture of Muhammad. A lot of Muhammad's artwork sort of portrays this compressed, tortured space of the occupied territories and the walls and the checkpoints, and the idea that, you know, the so-called Palestinian state is in fact kind of a prison in the real sense of, this very uncomfortable space. And Muhammad did his first graphic novel called Power Born of Dreams, which is, what do you know about a Palestinian guy who's in prison? Done all in woodcuts. Amazing, right? And even though it's based on his real experience of being in prison, there is an imaginative element. This bird comes to him in prison, and the artist and the bird make a deal that the bird will fly across the country and gather stories which the artist will illustrate. And so it's a series of stories that the bird brings back to the artist. And these are stories about all the things that are happening to Palestinians in different parts of the country. Really amazing, beautiful work. And this is some of the art that Mohammed has done since the attack on Gaza began. A lot of it very powerful, very disturbing. Okay, there's now a whole new generation of cartoonists coming out of Palestine. This is Shad al-Shamali, who recently left Gaza. She's living in Germany. She does very, very professional cartoons about the Palestinian situation. This is Fouad, who does very, very powerful color pieces about the war in Gaza. This is Safa, who is in Gaza and apparently does a lot of her drawings on tents in Gaza. This is my Sarah Baroud, who's also in Gaza and doing these drawings in Gaza. So one thing that I think is interesting is that if we look at Maysar Barud, and if we look at Zoya Cherkassky-Nnadi, we see the influence of Pablo Picasso. We see the influence specifically of Picasso's Guernica. This seems to be something that this Israeli cartoonist and this Palestinian cartoonist have in common, is this reference point to the Guernica. So, what is the Guernica? The Guernica was Picasso's reaction to the bombing of the city of Guernica by fascist military during the Spanish Civil War. The painting of the Guernica was held by the Museum of Modern Art, and Picasso said it could not be returned to Spain as long as Franco ruled Spain. And it was only returned to Spain after the end of the dictatorship. So Picasso actually created his own program of boycott and sanctions against the Spanish dictatorship with this painting, which was probably the most famous piece of modern art done by a Spanish national. Okay? Um, and of course, it's an incredibly influential, incredibly powerful painting. It's interesting how influential it is. This is a tapestry emulating the Guernica, which sits in the United Nations in a room where major decisions are made. Okay? So the United Nations paid somebody a lot of money to make a tapestry based on the Guernica. They felt it was really important to have the image of the bombing of Guernica present when they made decisions that would affect the world. So in the wake of World War I and World War II, we had this whole structure of ideas about international law, human rights, genocide, war crimes, codified by the United Nations and symbolized by the painting of the Guernica and put on display in the United Nations. So it was on display for all their discussions and decisions, except maybe, I don't know, maybe there were several times it wasn't on display. I know of one. And that was when Colin Powell went to the United Nations to say that Iran was making nuclear weapons and the United States should be able to invade Iran. And they did not want the Guernica on display when Colin Powell made that speech, so they pulled a curtain over it. So apparently the Guernica is good for Europe, but the Guernica is not good for the Middle East. When we're discussing the Middle East, if we're discussing Iraq, if we're discussing, Palestine, if we're discussing Gaza, the Guernica is no good, right? We can't look at that, right? So we have this whole set of notions about human rights, about democracy, about, war crimes, about genocide, but they don't apply to these people. We're not going to apply them here, okay? And this is why over the last 2 years, the image of the Guernica has become an image of protest again, right? So here's a protest in Spain where they used a giant image of the Guernica. So, that's sort of the question. We have a set of values, we apply it selectively. So that was why I thought we should look at artists from the Middle East or whatever you're going to call it. And Ethan Heitner helped me a lot in putting together this list of artists. And there are lots and lots of other artists coming out of the Middle East right now. Some of the most interesting comics in the world are coming out of the Middle East. You should check these artists out. Thank you.